following assumption has a profound impact on the policy recommendations I make and the views we should consider in any debate on North Korea. That assumption, at least that I start with, is that Kim Jong-il's survival, both economically and from a security perspective, is integral to his pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. In other words, you cannot divorce his pursuit of WMD from the survival of his regime. He not only uses this as a negotiating tactic for security purposes, but it's also critical to his economic survival as well. I found it sort of deeply ironic that as President Obama was in Europe calling for an eventual end to nuclear weapons, 5 hours earlier, North Korea was launching a long-range ballistic missile into the air. The point being is that North Korea was using this essentially as an advert for countries like Iran, perhaps Syria, Egypt, others out there who would want to procure ballistic missile technology from North Korea. So if you start from that assumption, essentially what I'm saying is that Kim Jong-il is not going to voluntarily give up his nuclear weapons. And that absent some type of regime change, I'm not saying that we invade, I'm saying but absent some type of change in regime, you're not going to see the end of nuclear weapons in North Korea. What does that mean in terms of policy? Essentially it means the six-party talks or any negotiated settlement that we're pursuing right now will not work. And if you look at what the Obama administration has done with the so-called reset button, or Vice President Biden in Germany saying we're going to adopt a new tone in foreign policy, the problem I have with that is, at best, it's naive, because I don't know what it means. The problem is that I actually think it's profoundly dangerous, because the way that the Irans, North Koreas, and Syrias around the world are going to interpret this is we can extract more from the United States. That's what the reset essentially means. I want to take a moment to discuss in more detail sort of how we got to where we are, and then offer a few policy recommendations as well. If you look at the six-party talks and when they formed in 2002, 2003, I at least understood the argument or the intellectual honesty of some of those who advocated the approach. The argument was essentially that in order to bring our allies on board, because we would need joint pressure on North Korea to essentially affect any type of change or real outcome, we at least had to go through the motions of trying to engage in the traditional diplomatic efforts. So I understood, although I presumed, and correctly, as it turned out, that they would be a disastrous failure, but I at least understood the point of sort of 1 or 2 rounds of this. However, it became very clear from the get-go that the six-party talks were not going to work. And that was for a very simple and fundamental reason, which was, it manifested itself in North Korea's denying that it had a uranium enrichment program. But essentially it goes back to the following underlying assumption, which is North Korea is not going to abandon their nuclear weapons or other WMD-related programs. And so we went through these diplomatic trappings, and if I had to fault the Powell and Armitage approach in the first term, it would be that they continued to put a happy face on each outcome of six-party talks. I attended several of these rounds, and every round was a success. And every round ended with North Korea not even admitting they had a uranium enrichment program. And to me, I don't know how you spin that or how you put a happy face on that. And so that was problematic for me. And I want to take about 30 seconds to discuss this whole uranium enrichment issue. You can debate the size, scope, and nature of the program, but all you have to do is read Musharraf's biography, and he will admit they sold uranium enrichment technology to North Korea. The point being is there's no question they were in direct and clear violation of the agreed framework. And this doesn't happen very often, but those of you who follow North Korea policy, I'm about to say something really nice about Jack Pritchard. Jack, to his credit, we disagree completely on how we should tackle the problem, but to Jack's credit, who's done work at Brookings and now he's at the Korea Economic Institute, at least acknowledge it. He said, I've read the intelligence, there's no question they are pursuing a uranium enrichment program. One can debate the quality of their engineers and when the program will be up and running, but they have a program. So that was, I give him credit for that. If you characterize the first term of the Bush administration as stalemate, I would characterize the second term as surrender. And that was a real problem for us. And for us, I mean John Bolton and I, when we were up at the UN. Say what you will about the UN, and there's a lot that can be said about it, and John has already said that much more eloquently than I have, but we did actually pass 2 reasonably good Security Council resolutions following North Korea's missile and subsequent nuclear test. Let's be clear, it's not to say that these Security Council resolutions were going to do much, but it helped build an international coalition to help isolate North Korea. China voted for the resolution, which I think symbolically mattered, and I'll get to that in a little bit. The problem, though, was the February 13th, 2009 agreement negotiated by Chris Hill. I applaud Chris Hill's service to our country. However, I do think he suffers from a problem that, in my 7 years dealing with the State Department, seemed to be pretty pervasive. If you're an academic, you become famous if you have a theory named after you. If you're a baseball player, you hit the most home runs. The problem, which I saw at the State Department, was that the zeal for the deal started to overtake real national security concerns. It got so bad that Condi Rice essentially had to tell him to stop doing press conferences. In other words, I think there was a sense that he really wanted to tackle the problem. He thought that just by talking to them, it was going to work. And I think one doesn't even need to look at history, one can look at present day events to suggest that that approach simply did not work. The problem, though, is that in addition to it not working, it fundamentally undermined our ability to move forward. Because essentially what we did was, we did have Security Council resolutions, we did have bans in place on selling various types of equipment, but after this February 13th deal, I had lots of countries coming up to me at the UN saying, you know, are the bans still in place? Why are we still isolating North Korea? You're talking about giving them civil nuclear reactors. There's a disconnect here, and it doesn't make any sense. And so it really put us into a pretty big hole. And I don't think I need to tell too many people in this room. I joke sometimes, I would love to negotiate a private sector salary with people from the State Department. Like they would walk into the room and say, I know I'm not going to, I want $5,000, I know I'm not going to get it, so I'm going to ask for one. In other words, their going in position is always to go down to the least common denominator. And I can't tell you how many times we would be in negotiations where Americans would say to me, but Mark, the Europeans aren't going to accept that. I'm like, well, we aren't advocating Europe's foreign policy here, we're advocating US foreign policy. But where do we go from here? And I'd like to close before we open it up to a Q&A. To at least end on a slightly positive note, to suggest that there are things we can do, but it's going to require a great deal of effort. The first 3 policy initiatives, I think, are complete no-brainers and apply irrespective of North Korea. First is, of course, aggressive pursuit of missile defense. Second would be extended or expanded resources to PSI, the Proliferation Security Initiative. And the third one, I actually think is pretty interesting. I don't know how familiar you guys are with FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. The point being is that one of the big mistakes in the second term was when we asked the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to essentially launder money for North Korea. But the point being is that just as we've seen institutions go after terrorist financing, FATF has now sort of dipped its toes, so to speak, into the waters of proliferation financing. And I think that's a good start. Because the point being is that if you look at when North Korea started hyperventilating, after we imposed sanctions on BDA, Banco del Asia, and Macau for money laundering, other banks around the world started saying, why are we dealing with these yahoos? It's not a lot of money to begin with, and we're going to be potentially subject to banking sanctions from the United States and other like-minded countries. So I think there actually is a lot of work that can be done in terrorist financing. I give a lot of credit. I had nothing to do with it to Stu Levy over at the Department of Treasury. I think he's done some great work. The second, so in terms of North Korea specific though, I would advocate a policy what I call aggressive isolation. And what I mean by that is when North Korea says, you guys have a hostile policy towards us. I mean, for example, there's a story in the Post today saying that Obama essentially hasn't changed. I think that's a negotiating tactic, but my preferred strategy would be to say, yeah, we do actually have a hostile policy towards you, and here's why. You are the world's most egregious abuser of human rights, if not #1 within the top 3. Our policy is to advance the cause of human rights. Second, you're the largest criminal manufacturer of methamphetamines around the world. Therefore, yes, we have a hostile policy. Third, you're exporting technology to Syria, Iran. So, yeah, we do have a hostile policy towards you, and we be blunt about it. And what you do then is, I'm under no illusion that I think that's going to change Kim Jong-il's behavior, but we begin doing a diplomatic effort to other countries and make it clear that there is a cost for them doing business with North Korea. Despite being an Asia advisor, as Fred can attest to, I had the opportunity to go to the Middle East when I was with John, because we were able to go to Egypt, we were able to go to Yemen and say, you know what, North Korea is not really the country you want to be doing business with. And there is at least some forward progress that can be made, albeit little. The fourth policy, or the fourth recommendation I would make would be travel bans. Let's be clear, North Korean officials, when they are overseas, are not there to promote North Korean cuisine or culture. They're there either to sell missiles and military technology, promote money laundering, or essentially engage in other criminal enterprises. And so I think the next step, even at the UN, probably won't happen in this administration, would be to impose travel bans on North Korean officials. Now, some people will say, and I'll close with this, Mark, what if you are completely wrong? And Kim Jong-il actually is capable of seeing the light like Gaddafi. I acknowledge that theoretical possibility, I wouldn't bet on it, but even if that is the case, if you do look at the Libya model, I think one can point to the fact of sustained international pressure as being the critical factor in getting Gaddafi to make the strategic decision to abandon his WMD. And so if in fact North Korea comes to us and says, hey, we're willing to choose a new path, I say, great, let's have our first negotiation be on verification and how we're going to have inspections in your country anywhere, anytime. And I'm not holding out hope on that, but we'll see. Thanks. Any questions? Fred. Working on an op-ed now tentatively titled, When Did North Korea Become More Important Than Japan? I think we have done a great disservice to Japan. We worked very hard to get them on board with this. We worked very hard to keep the abductee issue alive, and in the second term and in this administration, Japan just sort of seems to be on the sideline of this. And if I were in Japan right now, I would seriously be questioning the bilateral security alliance with the United States. And to the point where I would even be considering, 10 years ago, it would have been taboo to write an op-ed saying that Japan should rearm. Now it's actually discussed, in the op-ed pages within Japan. So I think we have done a great deal of harm to our relationship with Japan. And I think, Tom Schiefer, who was ambassador to Japan in the second term of the Bush administration, wrote a now public cable essentially blasting the administration's approach for sidelining Japan completely on this and keeping them out of the loop. And I think that's unfortunate. With respect to China, I think it's more complicated. One thing I didn't have time to go into, but part of the other reason why the six-party talks aren't going to work is because China's long-term strategic interest is to keep the peninsula divided. So that's their long-term security interest. They just simply want stability. And I tire of the argument, what I call the other equities argument. Every time we talk about putting pressure on China for any reason, whether it's proliferation or North Korea, somebody says, oh, we've got to give equities to China. And it's never a good time to put pressure on China. It's never a good time anytime, right? But you have to do it. And so I think with respect to China, we just need to recognize that their strategic interests are different than ours, and we need to proceed accordingly. They have tried through every venue possible to restrict our ability to act through proliferation security initiative, through a variety of other measures, and I think we just have to ignore that.